She arrived at the edge of nowhere with a baby on her hip, a suitcase held together by twine, and a letter that was supposed to mean salvation. The man at the door looked at the infant, looked at Lillian Cross, and said, "I hired a cook, not a mother." Behind her, the Montana sky was turning the color of a bruise, and the wind had teeth. She had no money, no horse, no way back. Most women would have wept. Lillian set down her suitcase, walked past him into the kitchen, and started a fire. If a story like this moves something in you, like this video, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Follow along so you don't miss what happens next. The stagecoach left her at the junction without ceremony. No station, no overhang to block the wind, no soul in sight except a weathered post with a board nailed crooked to it that read Black Ridge. 4 miles and pointed north toward nothing but gray sky and a road that was more suggestion than fact. The driver had already turned the horses before her second foot hit the ground. She called after him to wait just one moment, please, just long enough to get Hazel repositioned, but he either didn't hear or didn't care, and the wheels threw a fan of half-frozen mud across the hem of her coat as the coach disappeared around the tree line. Lillian Cross stood still for a moment. She was 26 years old, and she had learned in the past 3 months that stillness was sometimes the only thing she had left to give herself before she had to start moving again. Hazel made a sound against her chest. Not a cry, just a soft grunt of protest at the cold. And Lillian pulled the wool blanket tighter around the baby's head and picked up the suitcase with her free hand and started walking north. The letter was in her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times the creases had gone soft, the ink slightly smeared at the fold where her thumb always pressed when she pulled it out. Cook needed at Black Ridge Ranch. Board and wage provided. Write to Silas Boone, Harlan County. She had written. He had written back. 2 sentences. Come before December. Bring nothing you can't carry. She had taken that as a good sign at the time. Now, with December sitting on the land like a stone and 4 miles of frozen track ahead of her and an 8-month-old daughter who was going to need feeding within the hour, she was less certain about what it had meant. She walked. The cold out here wasn't like Missouri cold. Back home, winter came in through the windows and settled in the corners of rooms and made you want a second quilt. Montana cold was different. It was a presence. It came at you sideways and got inside your collar and your sleeves and found every gap in every layer you had. And it didn't just make you uncomfortable. It made you understand in a way that was almost philosophical that it did not care about you at all. The landscape didn't either. The peaks to the west were already white, and the meadows on either side of the road were a pale, dead yellow under a sky the color of pewter. And there was no smoke anywhere. No sound except wind and Lillian's boots on the hard ground, and every so often a thin sound from Hazel. She talked to Hazel while she walked. She'd been doing that since Hazel was born, a habit she'd started in the hospital room in Butte while Thomas was still alive and they were both still believing he'd recover from the cave-in. She'd talked to the baby then to fill the silence of that room, and she'd kept doing it after, because talking to Hazel was the only kind of talking that didn't require her to answer questions about what she was going to do now, how she was managing, whether she'd considered going back to her mother's. 4 miles isn't far, she said. We've done worse. They had. The 3 days in Butte after the burial, when she'd had $12 and a list of options that got shorter every morning. The train ride north with Hazel spiking a fever somewhere past Great Falls. Lillian sitting up through the night with a wet cloth and a prayer she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. We just keep walking, that's all. Hazel did not dispute this. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Wood smoke, cattle, the particular cold hay smell of a working barn. Then the road curved and the fence line appeared, weathered posts running in both directions, and beyond it a cluster of buildings that resolved themselves gradually out of the gray afternoon. A large house, a barn twice the size of it, several outbuildings, a water tower, a bunkhouse further back. There were horses and a pen near the barn, smoke from 2 chimneys, signs of life at least. The gate was open, which she took as permission. She was halfway across the yard when the front door of the house opened and a man came out onto the porch without a coat, which told her something about him before he'd said a word. He was tall and angular in the way of men who have spent years in wind and work. Not thin exactly, but stripped down. Nothing on him that wasn't useful. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that had been weathered into something sharp and not unkind exactly, but not warm either. He was watching her cross the yard the way you'd watch something you weren't sure needed your attention yet. "Mr. Boone?" she called. "That's right." She came to the foot of the porch steps and stopped. She could feel Hazel stirring against her chest, waking up from the motion of the walk. Bad timing, she thought. "I'm Lillian Cross. I wrote to you in October about the cook position." But something shifted in his expression. A brief recalibration. Something between surprise and displeasure. His eyes went from her face to the bundle against her chest and stayed there. "You didn't mention a baby in your letter," he said. "No." She didn't offer an explanation. She'd learned that offering explanations before someone asked for them gave them more ammunition. "The position is for a cook." His voice was flat, not cruel, just stating it like a correction. "Room and board for one. I've got 6 men in that bunkhouse that need feeding twice a day, and a kitchen that's been running on Denny's salt pork and burnt coffee since September. I'm not operating a—" He paused, as if deciding the right word. "A family arrangement." "I understand the position." "I don't think you do, Mrs. Cross, because if you did, you'd have mentioned the child in your correspondence." That landed. She felt it. She also felt Hazel finally wake up fully and push against the blanket with both hands, making the small, irritated sounds that preceded a genuine cry, and Lillian shifted her weight to bounce her slightly, which was automatic now, something she did without thinking. "You have a long way to go to find the next situation," she said. It wasn't a plea, just a fact, stated in the same register he'd used. "That's true. And it's going to snow by tonight." She looked at the sky to the northwest, where the clouds had thickened into something low and purposeful. "Hard snow, I'd guess. Maybe 2 days of it." He looked at the same sky. Whatever he saw there didn't seem to improve his position. "I'm sorry you made the trip," he said. "I can have one of the men drive you back to the junction in the morning if the road's passable." "The morning," she said. "Tonight's not—" "Tonight, I understand. I'm asking about tonight, Mr. Boone. Whether you intend to send me and my daughter back out into that in the dark." He looked at her for a long moment. She held very still. Hazel had settled again somehow, just long enough. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said finally. "It's cold. I'll have someone put a stove in it." "Thank you." He turned to go back inside. "Mr. Boone." She said it quietly. He stopped, his hand on the door. "What time do your men eat supper?" He turned back. Something moved behind his eyes. Suspicion or something close to it. 6 o'clock. "I'll have it ready," she said. She watched his jaw work slightly, like he was deciding whether to argue the point. Then he went inside without another word and closed the door. The kitchen was cold. Cold and cluttered in the specific way of a room where men have been cooking in a functional, joyless way for a long time. Grease-darkened cast iron stacked without order, a cutting board so stained it had probably never been properly scrubbed, flour sifted into a tin that hadn't been sealed and had gone partly damp, a half-used slab of salt pork sitting on the counter unwrapped. The stove itself was in decent shape, a big Monarch range with 2 ovens, which was something. Whoever had kept this kitchen before had known what they were doing. That knowledge had been gone a while. There was a young man sitting at the kitchen table when she came in, maybe 20, with the soft face of someone who hadn't been out west long enough yet for it to carve him down. He was nursing a cup of something and looked up at her with genuine surprise. "You must be the cook," he said. "Lillian Cross." "Eddie Marsh." He stood up, which was polite, and then seemed not to know what to do with himself standing. His eyes went to Hazel. "That's a baby." "She is." "Mr. Boone know about her?" "He and I just had a fairly direct conversation about it." Eddie Marsh looked toward the door, then back at Lillian, then at Hazel again. "He gonna let you stay?" "For tonight, at least." She set the suitcase down by the door to the back room and looked around the kitchen. "Where do you keep the potatoes?" "Root cellar, through that door and down the steps. There's onions, too, and some turnips. Denny bought a side of beef last week. It's hanging in the smokehouse." "Who's Denny?" Our cook. He got a letter from his daughter in Idaho. Her husband had an accident. He left 3 weeks ago. Mr. Boone's been trying to manage since. The men are—" He searched for a diplomatic word and gave up on diplomacy. Unhappy. What have they been eating? He made a face that communicated more than words. All right, she said. She was already moving toward the root cellar door, Hazel still in her arms. Is there someone who could sit with her for 20 minutes while I get things organized? She's fed and she won't fuss if someone holds her, but I need both hands. Eddie looked momentarily alarmed by the prospect, then steadied himself. I can do that, he said. I got sisters. I know how. She handed Hazel over to him without ceremony. He took the baby with the careful confidence of someone who had in fact done this before, and something in Lillian unknotted very slightly. One of those small, almost imperceptible relaxations that came when a practical problem solved itself. She went down to the root cellar. What she found in the kitchen, she turned into food. It was a skill she'd had since she was 12 years old, learning beside her mother in a farmhouse in central Missouri where there was never quite enough of anything, which meant you learned to make what there was into something. Tonight there were potatoes, onions, the good beef from the smokehouse, dried beans she found at the back of a cabinet, cornmeal, and a small amount of lard. She made a beef and potato stew with onions and black pepper, dense and hot, and she made cornbread, real cornbread with a proper crust on it. And she set coffee on to boil because that, at least, they had enough of. She worked with Hazel in a crate she'd padded with a folded blanket near the stove. Hazel approved of the warmth and lay on her back examining the ceiling with great interest, which was what she usually did when she was content. Lillian talked to her while she cooked the way she always did, narrating things in a low voice, and twice she heard someone pause outside the kitchen door, listening, and then move on. At 5 minutes to 6, Eddie Marsh put his head in and sniffed, and his expression did something that, on someone less controlled, would have been a noise. That smells like actual food, he said. It is actual food. Can I tell the men to come in? 5 minutes. Let me get it on the table. But he disappeared. She could hear him talking to someone in the hall, couldn't hear the words, but heard the response. Low, incredulous, and then footsteps. 6 men came into the kitchen dining room. They came in like men who had learned not to expect much and were bracing for more of the same, and then the smell of the stew hit them, and they all stopped moving at once, just for a beat, like something had physically arrested them. Then they were sitting down and bowls were being passed, and the cornbread was going hand to hand, and the room had the particular quality of people eating seriously, which is a specific kind of silence, not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of attention. Lillian set a bowl at the end of the table and went back to the stove to check on Hazel. Ma'am. One of the men, older, 50s, with a white mustache she would later learn belonged to a man named Carl Pruitt, who had worked this ranch for 11 years. This is the best meal that's come out of this kitchen in at least 2 years. That's a low bar, she said. A few of them laughed. The tension in the room dropped several degrees. Where'd you come from? Someone asked from the middle of the table. Butte, most recently. Long way. Yes. Your husband coming? She kept her back to them for just a moment, adjusting the blanket around Hazel. My husband passed in June. Mining accident. The room went quiet in a different way. Sorry, the same voice said, genuinely. Thank you. She turned back to the stove. There's more stew in the pot if anyone wants it. They all wanted it. So, she was washing up when Silas Boone came into the kitchen. The men had gone back to the bunkhouse. Hazel was asleep in the crate near the stove, which was still throwing good heat. Lillian was at the basin working through the stack of bowls. She heard him come in but didn't turn around. He stood there for a moment. She could feel him looking at the kitchen, at the cleared surfaces, the stacked clean ironware, the order where there had been disorder, and then at Hazel in the crate. Men said supper was good, he said finally. There's stew left on the stove, and cornbread. He was quiet. She heard him move to the stove, heard the sound of the ladle against the pot. When she finished the last bowl and turned around to dry her hands, he was sitting at the corner of the table with a bowl in front of him, eating. He ate the way men do when they've been making do with bad food for too long. Not fast, but with a concentrated attention that was almost private, like something was happening that he didn't want an audience for. She hung up the dish towel. She picked up Hazel, who made a sleepy protest and then settled against her shoulder, and she carried her toward the back room. "Mrs. Cross." She stopped. She waited. "6 o'clock breakfast," he said. "Same as supper. Men need it hot." She turned around just enough to see him. "I'll have it ready," she said. He didn't look up from the stew. "The room's still cold." Eddie was supposed to. "I'll manage." She went into the back room and closed the door. It was cold and dark, and the straw mattress on the narrow cot smelled like dust. She laid Hazel down and curled herself around the baby for warmth and pulled the coat over both of them. Outside, the wind had found the building and was making itself known at every seam. She could hear it searching the eaves, testing the window, pushing under the door. The sky had finally made good on the promise it had been building all afternoon. Hard snow. Maybe 2 days of it. She lay in the dark listening to it and thought, all right then. All right. She had 1 night, maybe 2, if the snow came down hard enough. That was all she'd been given, and she had learned not to need more than what was in front of her. 1 night to make herself necessary. 1 morning to make breakfast so good that sending her away felt like a cost the man was not willing to pay. She thought about the kitchen and what was in it and what she could do with it. Hazel breathed warm and steady against her chest. The wind threw itself against the window and found no way in. Lillian Cross did not sleep for a long time, but when she did, she slept without dreaming. Kimbats. Morning came gray and white. She was up before 5. She built the kitchen fire while Hazel slept in the crate she'd moved to the warm corner by the stove. She found a canister of oats and set a pot of porridge on the back burner. She sliced salt pork thin and laid it in the iron skillet. She mixed a proper batter for flapjacks, real ones, with a little sugar in them, the way you made them when you wanted people to feel like something good had happened to them before they'd even finished waking up. She set bread to rise. She had found a jar of preserved plums at the back of a high cabinet, the kind of thing that gets pushed to the back and forgotten, and she set them out in a bowl on the table because it was a small thing, but it was color and sweetness in a kitchen that had neither. The men came in at 6. She saw it happen to them one by one. The smell of the food, the sight of the table, the plums. Carl Pruitt stopped cold in the doorway and just looked at the table for a moment before he sat down. Eddie Marsh said something under his breath that she didn't catch. A big man named Hector Torres, who she would learn was the foreman and not given to expressiveness, put his hat on a hook and sat down and poured his own coffee, and then sat there for a moment just holding the cup with both hands, eyes closed. She set the platters out. She poured coffee. She came back to check on Hazel and found that the baby had woken up and was doing what she did in the mornings, which was lying on her back making experimental sounds and waving her arms at the ceiling. "What's her name?" It was Carl, from across the kitchen. "Hazel." "Hazel," he said, tasting it. He had a piece of flapjack on his fork, and he looked at the baby and said, "Morning, Hazel," very seriously, the way some old men will address babies, as if they find them fundamentally reasonable. Hazel made a sound back at him. "Well," said Carl. He ate the flapjack. Silas Boone came into the kitchen at 6:10. Lillian was at the stove. She heard the change in the room when he entered, a slight adjustment in posture from the men, the specific quality of a boss in the room's silence, and she turned and set a plate in front of the empty place at the table head without being asked. He looked at the plate. He looked at the table, the food, the plums, the full coffee cups. She could see him taking it in, calculating something. She went back to the stove. She heard him sit down. Nobody said anything about the previous night's conversation. Nobody said anything about the previous night's conversation because to say anything about it would have required acknowledging that there was a question about whether Lillian was staying, and at 6 o'clock in the morning with flapjacks on the table and coffee in the cups. Nobody in that room wanted to entertain that question. Lillian Cross understood something about men that had taken her time to learn. There were arguments you won with words, and there were arguments you won by making it too inconvenient to win. She made it inconvenient. 3 days passed before Silas Boone said anything direct about the situation. In those 3 days, the snow fell and kept falling, 2 feet of it piling against the north-facing walls and drifting to the windowsills of the outbuildings. Nobody went anywhere. The ranch shut in on itself the way ranches do in a hard Montana winter, the world contracting to the distance between the house and the barn and back, and everything outside that perimeter belonging to a different kind of existence entirely. Lillian cooked. That was what she did. She cooked breakfast and supper, and in between, she cleaned the kitchen properly for the first time in what looked like months, scrubbing the boards under the stove, washing the flour canisters, organizing the root cellar inventory so she knew exactly what she had and could plan accordingly. She found a sack of dried apples she turned into a pie. She made soup from the bones of the beef roast and the heel of a turnip and whatever she could find, and it was better soup than most people made from real ingredients. Hazel was, by nature, a reasonably cooperative baby. Not easy exactly, but the kind of infant who seemed to understand, in the vague, instinctive way of young creatures, when crying was going to cause problems, and who often refrained from causing them. She sat in her crate by the stove and watched the kitchen with a focused attention that Lillian recognized as her own expression turned 8 months old, and the ranch hands who came through in the evenings for coffee began stopping to talk to her, and she watched them with the same seriousness she watched everything, and this seemed to please them. Carl Pruitt took to sitting with her in the afternoons when Lillian was in the root cellar or the smokehouse. He would pull a chair up next to the crate and whittle. He was making something, she couldn't tell what yet, and talk to Hazel in a low rumble about things that weren't particularly intended for a baby, but that she responded to with the same grave attention she gave to everything. On the third morning, Silas Boone came into the kitchen after breakfast when the men had gone out and Lillian was kneading bread dough. He stood in the doorway. She worked the dough. "I'm not a man who changes his position easily," he said. She kept kneading, "and I want to be clear that I didn't change it. The weather changed it. When the road opens, we'll discuss." "Mr. Boone." She still didn't look up. "Your kitchen smells like bread for the first time in however long. Your men went out this morning looking like men instead of problems waiting to happen. Whatever you need to tell yourself about what that means, go ahead. But I'd appreciate you not telling it to me at 7 in the morning when I have 2 loaves to get in the oven." Silence. She turned the dough and worked her palms into it. $6 a month, he said. "Same as Denny made." She stopped kneading. She looked up. His face was exactly the same, hard and carefully empty. But there was something behind it that was not empty at all. She had the sense she was looking at a man who had made a decision he expected to cost him something and had decided the cost was acceptable. "Hazel stays in the kitchen with me during work hours," she said. "She doesn't cause trouble." "I noticed. And the room needs a proper stove. The one in there smokes." "I'll have Eddie look at it." "Today," she said. Something moved across his face that might, in a different face, have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't make it all the way there, but the impulse was visible. "Today," he said. He walked out. Lillian Cross looked down at the bread dough and pressed her palms into it and kneaded it, firm and even, the way her mother had taught her in that kitchen in Missouri when she was 12 years old and the world had seemed large and full and utterly uncertain, which was the same way it seemed now, just with different particulars. She put the bread in the oven. Outside the window, the snow was still falling, steady and indifferent and in no particular hurry. She stood at the window for a moment and watched it. Then she turned back to the kitchen because there was always something more to do. The bread sold him. That was what Lillian decided later, when she had enough distance from those first weeks to think about them clearly. Not the stew, not the flapjacks, not the preserved plums she'd found at the back of the cabinet. The bread. Specifically, the smell of it moving through the house on that third morning, while the snow was still coming down and Silas Boone was standing in the kitchen doorway, trying to convince himself he was making a practical decision rather than an emotional one. A man could talk himself out of a lot of things, but he couldn't talk himself out of what fresh bread did to a cold house that had been without it for too long. It didn't smell like food. It smelled like something that had been missing. She understood that. She just didn't say it. What she said was $6 a month, a working stove in the back room, and Hazel stays. And he said yes. And that was how it started. The days organized themselves around work, which was the only way Lillian knew how to organize days. She was up before 5 every morning, a habit so old it had stopped requiring effort, and she had the kitchen fire going and the coffee on before the sky outside the small window above the basin had decided what color it intended to be. December in Montana made that decision slowly. Sometimes the light came up blue, sometimes a pale yellow-gray, sometimes just a general brightening of the dark that passed for dawn without committing to it. She noticed these things while she cooked: the light, the wind direction, whether the temperature had dropped in the night, and by how much. Not because they were beautiful, but because they were information. The kitchen was her domain, and the weather was what determined what the kitchen needed to be doing. Biscuits on heavy snow mornings, because men coming in from chores in knee-deep cold needed something dense and hot to anchor them. Porridge on the mornings when the temperature dropped hard and fast, because it held warmth longer than anything else, and the men had a long day ahead of them. She calibrated what she made to what she read in the sky and the wind and the particular quality of the silence outside, and after 2 weeks she was calibrating it to the men themselves, who ate quickly and went back out, who needed a second cup of coffee to get moving, who came in already inside their own heads and needed to be left alone. There were 6 of them in the bunkhouse. Carl Pruitt, 53, white mustache, 11 years on the ranch, who said little and observed everything, and had apparently decided on the first morning that Lillian was acceptable. Eddie Marsh, 21, from Ohio, still growing into himself, who had a habit of starting sentences with, "My mother used to," before catching himself and stopping, which she chose not to comment on. Hector Torres, the foreman, 40, with a methodical quality to everything he did: the way he came in, hung his hat, washed his hands, sat down, all of it precise without being performative. Dex and Roy Calloway, brothers from somewhere in the South, inseparable and loud in the way of men who had spent their whole lives having only each other for company. And a quiet Scandinavian named Anders Lindqvist, who was perhaps the largest human being Lillian had ever seen, and who ate more at a single sitting than she would have thought anatomically possible, but who always, without fail, said, "Thank you, ma'am," when he finished, which she appreciated more than he knew. She learned them the way she'd learned every kitchen she'd ever worked in, by what they didn't say as much as what they did. Roy Calloway had a bad back he tried not to show, so she started adding extra portions to his plate without comment, more calories for a body working through pain. Anders got headaches in the low-pressure days before storms. She noticed because he pressed 2 fingers to his temple without realizing he was doing it, and she started keeping a small pot of strong peppermint tea available on those mornings. Eddie Marsh was homesick in the specific gutted way of young men who would rather die than admit it, and she made his mother's biscuit recipe, or something close to what she imagined his mother's biscuit recipe might be, and watched him eat 3 of them with an expression that was almost painful. These were small things. She didn't think of them as kindness exactly. She thought of them as cooking done properly, which meant knowing who you were feeding. Hazel continued to be, by the standards of ranch hand opinion, a satisfactory baby. This was a verdict arrived at gradually, over the course of 2 weeks, and Lillian found it quietly funny. The way the men had moved from tolerating Hazel's presence to actively seeking it out, without any of them appearing to notice the shift. Carl still sat with her in the afternoons, still whittling whatever it was he was whittling. Eddie taught her peekaboo with enormous seriousness, as though it were a skill she needed to master before she could progress. Even Hector Torres, who was not a man who altered his expression for anything short of structural emergency, had been observed by Lillian one Tuesday morning, crouching in front of the crate and making a face at Hazel that no one who knew him professionally would have believed possible. He stood up when he heard Lillian come back in from the smokehouse and became immediately and completely Hector Torres, the foreman. Again. But she had seen it, and she filed it away without comment. What she did not know how to file away yet was Silas Boone. He was at breakfast every morning and supper most evenings, ate what she put in front of him without complaint, said thank you, and left. That was the extent of their interaction for the first 2 weeks, which was not strange. It was a working ranch. He was running it. There was no particular reason for the owner of the establishment to make conversation with the cook beyond the transactional. But she was aware of him in the way you became aware of something that was structurally significant to your situation, the way you were aware of a load-bearing wall. He moved through the house with the particular economy of a man who had lived alone in a space long enough that he and it had reached some wordless agreement about the terms of coexistence. The house was not dirty, but it was not cared for. There was a difference. Things were maintained to the level of function and no further. A loose hinge on the pantry door, a window in the parlor with a cracked pane covered in oilskin, a runner in the front hall with a pulled thread that caught your heel if you didn't know to avoid it. Not neglect exactly. more like a man who had stopped noticing, or had made a decision to stop noticing. She found out about his family the way she found out most things on the ranch, obliquely, from Carl, in the middle of a conversation about something else. They were in the kitchen late one afternoon, Carl at the table with his whittling and Lillian doing the inventory for the week ahead. Hazel was asleep. "House used to feel different," Carl said, without particular preamble. She looked up. "When?" she said. "Before?" He didn't look up from the wood in his hands. His wife's name was Margaret. His boy was named William. William was about 4 years old. He paused, worked the knife around a curve. Fever took them both, same week, about 7 years ago now. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the wind outside. He never... Carl started and stopped and tried again. He didn't quit or anything like that. You can't quit on a ranch. Things still need doing. He just got smaller, I guess. Not in size, just got smaller. Lillian looked in the window. "He hired Denny about a year after," Carl said. "Denny's a fine cook, good man. But a different thing than..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She understood what he was saying without him saying it. That the house had been without a certain quality for a long time. That it wasn't just Denny's absence that had made it bleak, even before she arrived. That the bleak had been there longer than that, and the cause of it was something nobody on the ranch talked about, but everybody understood. She went back to her inventory. Carl went back to his whittling. She didn't bring it up with Silas. She wouldn't. It wasn't her information to act on. But it changed how she saw the house. She looked at the oilskin on the cracked window differently now. She looked at the front hall runner differently. She started to see not a man who had stopped caring, but a man who had carried something for so long that he'd learned to move around it without seeing it anymore, the way you learn to move around furniture in a dark room. She fixed the runner herself. One morning when she had an hour, found thread in the sewing kit she'd brought in her suitcase. She fixed the pantry hinge with a screwdriver from the tool shelf in the mudroom. She didn't say anything about either of these things. She just did them. She didn't know if Silas noticed. 2 weeks later, she came into the kitchen one morning to find the cracked window pane had been replaced with real glass. He hadn't said anything about that either. The ranch found a rhythm. That was the only way to describe it. Not peace, exactly. Not happiness, but the particular order that comes when people with a common purpose start moving in the same direction without having to be reminded. Breakfast at 6, chores, dinner around noon if the work allowed, supper at 6, and in the evenings the kitchen was warm and the bunkhouse had light in its windows, and the house wasn't just maintained but inhabited, which was a different thing. Lillian expanded what she could do with the kitchen as she learned what was available. She found a kitchen garden plot behind the house, buried under snow now, but visible in the way of gardens that have been properly tended in the past. Good deep beds, straw mulch underneath, the ghosts of last summer's structure still readable in the arrangement of the soil. Somebody had cared about that garden. She made a note to ask Carl about it, and then thought about what he'd said about Margaret and decided not to. She made soup from dried beans and smoked pork and whatever herbs she found in the small tin cabinet above the stove. Rosemary gone dusty, sage, a small amount of dried thyme that still had some life in it. She made a pot roast on Sunday that the men ate in a silence so comprehensive it was almost a form of prayer. She made apple cake from the dried apples she'd been saving, with a little cinnamon and brown sugar, and set it on the table at supper and watched 6 grown ranch hands have the same expression a child has on a birthday morning. "My mother made apple cake," Eddie said. He said it before he could stop himself and then looked at the ceiling. "It's a good thing to know how to make," Lillian said, not looking at him, not making anything of it. He ate 2 pieces. It was Hector Torres who told her, midway through December, that Silas had been out at the woodshed in the early mornings before anyone else was up. "Thought you'd want to know," was how Hector phrased it, very neutral, setting his coffee cup down and looking at some middle distance above her left shoulder. "Why would I want to know that?" she said. "Woodpile outside the kitchen door," he said. "Been getting bigger." She looked at him. He looked at the middle distance. "All right," she said. "None of my business," he said, and took his coffee and went out. She went to the kitchen door and looked at the woodpile. It had indeed gotten larger. Not dramatically, but noticeably, new-cut pieces stacked on top of the old, seasoned ones, the pale fresh wood of recent splitting showing at the edges. She stood there for a moment with the cold coming through the open door and thought about a man waking before dawn and going to the woodshed with an axe without saying anything to anyone about it. She closed the door. She did not say anything about it to Silas. 2 days later, on an evening when the temperature dropped hard and the stove was working to keep up with it, she found that the kitchen had draft coming up through a gap between the floorboards near the back wall. She'd noticed it for a week but hadn't found the time to deal with it. She came in the following morning to find a length of rope caulking pressed into the gap, sealing it properly. She stood there looking at it with the coffee pot in her hand. He hadn't said anything about that either. They were conducting, she understood, a kind of conversation that neither of them had the language for yet, or possibly the nerve. He fixed things. She cooked things. The house got warmer. These were facts and not explanations, and she was not sure she needed them to be more than that. What she was sure of was that it complicated the situation in ways she had not prepared for when she walked into this kitchen on that first day with the blizzard at her back and nothing but necessity in her hands. Hazel turned 9 months old on the 21st of December, which Lillian knew only because she counted backward from June and marked it in the flour dust on the counter with her finger and then wiped it away. She had been so consumed by the mechanics of survival in those first months, the immediate and non-negotiable requirements of an infant, the logistical reality of Thomas's death and the estate and the debts and the decisions, that she hadn't had much room to think about Hazel as a person rather than a responsibility. That was something that happened in the kitchen at Black Ridge, in the slow accumulation of ordinary days. She started to see her daughter. The particular way Hazel looked at new things, which was with her head tilted very slightly to one side, like she was filing information. The way she laughed, infrequent and genuine, not the nervous or reflexive kind, but actual laughter, when something struck her as funny, which was unpredictable and always unexpected. She had Thomas's coloring, the dark hair and gray eyes, and sometimes Lillian would look at her and find something so precisely, specifically Thomas looking back at her, that she had to look away. She let herself do that, look away, and then she looked back. She had not allowed herself to grieve properly. There had not been time or space for it, was the truth, and she was a practical woman who understood that a practical woman sometimes had to postpone her own interior life for the sake of her functional one. But the interior life didn't disappear just because you postponed it. It waited. In the evenings, after supper was cleaned and Hazel was fed and the kitchen was put right, she had an hour or two before sleep that were hers. She sat in the chair near the stove with whatever mending needed doing, because idle hands in a cold room were just cold hands, and she let herself think. She thought about Thomas and Missouri and the life that had been going in one direction and then went in another. She thought about Hazel and what she was going to need as she got bigger. She thought occasionally about the garden under the snow outside the kitchen window and what it might look like in April. She was thinking about the garden one evening, the last Thursday of December, the new year still a week away, when Silas Boone came into the kitchen later than usual. She looked up. It was past 8, late for him. He looked tired in a way he didn't usually show, something worn at the edges of his face. "There's stew left," she said. "I know." He came in and sat down at the corner of the table, which was where he always sat, and she ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of him and went back to her chair and her mending. He ate for a while. She sewed. The stove knocked twice the way it did when it was hitting a good temperature. "Hector says we might have 200 head missing from the north pasture count," he said. "Probably drifted in the last storm. We'll have to push up into the ridge breaks after the new year and see." She didn't know enough about cattle to say anything useful, so she said, "How long would that take?" "Week, maybe? Depends on what we find." "That's a long time in January." "It is." He looked at the bowl. "Can't be helped." She worked the needle through the fabric. "The colt in the south barn," he said, after a moment, "is going to be a problem. He's been off his feed since Tuesday. Eddie said something about that. Eddie worries about things he can't fix." He said it without rancor. "Vet can't get out here until the road's better, so you manage." "That's the job." She looked up at him. He was looking at the bowl, not at her, but the look on his face was the look of a man who is not actually thinking about what he appears to be thinking about. A look she recognized because she'd had it herself. In the evenings in this same kitchen, when she was ostensibly thinking about the garden and actually thinking about Thomas, she almost said something. She didn't know what, Just the impulse was there to say something that acknowledged the actual conversation rather than the pretend one. But she didn't know him well enough, and he didn't know her well enough, and some acknowledgments made too early collapsed the distance they were trying to bridge. So she said, "Is there enough salt pork to last through February?" He blinked, came back from wherever he'd been. "Should be. Hector bought a good supply before the first snow." "I'll check what we have," she said. "Make a list of what we need before the next supply run." "All right." He finished the stew. He stood, picked up the bowl, brought it to the basin himself, and she noticed this, the fact that he didn't leave it, and rinsed it the way someone does who has lived alone and had to do for himself for a long time. "Good stew," he said. "It's the same as yesterday's." Yesterday's was good too. He walked to the doorway and stopped there for a moment, his back to her. She went on with the mending. "The garden," he said. "The one at the back." She looked up. "Margaret put it in, the second year we were here." He didn't turn around, so "It's got good soil, deep beds. She took care of it." He stopped. She waited. "The seeds are in the tin box in the pantry," he said. "Top shelf, behind the cornmeal, in case you want them, come spring." He walked out. Lillian sat in her chair by the stove for a long time after that, the mending in her lap, the needle motionless. The stove knocked. Hazel breathed. The house settled around them both, slow and quiet, the way houses do when the cold outside is a fact and not a threat. She thought about a tin box on the top shelf of the pantry. She thought about seeds saved from a garden that was 7 years old. She thought about what it meant, that they were still there. In the morning, she got up before 5 and built the fire and made the coffee and started the biscuits. And when the kitchen was warm and smelling of something good, she stood on her toes and found the tin box where he'd said it was and opened it. Inside, small paper envelopes, labeled in handwriting that was not Silas Boone's, organized carefully. Tomatoes, squash, beans, radishes. A small folded paper that said sweet peas in the same handwriting, and beneath that in pencil, the word Margaret's in different script, as if someone had added it after. She closed the tin and put it back. She thought about spring. Then she went back to the biscuits, because the men would be in from the barn in 20 minutes, and Carl would want his coffee before anyone else, and Eddie's biscuit always needed to be slightly larger than the others, even though she'd never told him she'd noticed, and there was always something more to be done. She put the tin box at the front of the shelf where she could see it. She didn't say anything about it to anyone. The house was warmer than it had been in December. The kitchen smelled like biscuits. Outside the window, the last week of the old year lay cold and white and very still. And somewhere on the top shelf of the pantry, behind the cornmeal, 7 years of waiting sat in small labeled envelopes in a tin box, next to a word written in a dead woman's handwriting. And what came next was still uncertain, which was exactly how Lillian Cross had learned to live. The new year came in without ceremony. There was no celebration at Black Ridge. No one had the energy for it, and the cold didn't care about the calendar anyway. January arrived the way January always did in that part of Montana, which was like a door closing. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees from where it had been in December, and the sky went the color of dirty iron, and the wind that came down off the ridge to the northwest had a quality to it that was different from the December wind. Less searching, more decided, like it had made up its mind about something and wasn't open to discussion. Lillian felt it in the kitchen. The stove worked harder. The bread took longer to rise. The morning fire needed more tending because the cold got into the box overnight and made starting it a 2-match job instead of 1. These were small calibrations, the kind she made automatically now, after 6 weeks of learning the particular personality of this kitchen in this house on this piece of Montana ground. 6 weeks. That was what it had been since she'd walked across the yard with Hazel on her hip and a suitcase held together by twine, and Silas Boone had looked at the baby and said, "I hired a cook, not a mother." 6 weeks felt like a long time, and also like no time at all, which was the specific confusion of a life that had changed its shape so completely that you couldn't quite remember the dimensions of the previous one. Hector Torres came in on the second morning of January, with snow still on his hat brim, and the particular expression he wore when he had information that was not good, but was also not a crisis yet. "We're going after the drift cattle," he said. "Mr. Boone wants to move out the day after tomorrow. Weather window looks passable."
Lillian was making porridge. She stirred it. How many men? All of them. We need the hands. He paused. That includes me. I know.
You'll be here with the baby and whatever Anders leaves behind, which is nothing, because Anders is coming too. She looked at him then. How long? 3 days at the minimum. Could be 5 if the cattle have gone deep into the breaks. He said it straight, no softening, which she appreciated. There's enough wood laid in. The stove in the main room is reliable. Keep the kitchen fire going and the back hall door closed, and you'll hold heat in the main rooms fine. I know how to manage a stove, Hector. I know you do. He took his coffee cup and sat down. Something in his posture said he wasn't finished. There's the colt still. He's eating now, but he's not right. I'll leave you instructions. I've dealt with sick animals before. These are ranch horses. It's different from Hector. She set the spoon down and looked at him. I'm from Missouri. My father had horses. I know the difference between a colt that needs watching and a colt that needs a vet, and I know which one this is. Go find your cattle. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once the way he nodded when a thing was settled. She went back to the porridge. There's something else, he said. She waited. Mr. Boone doesn't... He stopped, tried again. He's not a man who asks for help easily. If something went wrong out there, he'd manage it himself before he'd send for help. He's always been that way. She understood what he was telling her without him saying it explicitly. She didn't know what to do with it yet, so she filed it. I'll have food ready when you get back, she said. That's what I figured. He finished the coffee, stood, put on his hat. Keep the northwest window shuttered after noon. Wind'll find it. He went out. She stood at the stove and thought about 5 days alone in a house in January in Montana with a 9-month-old and a sick colt and a wind that had made up its mind about something. And she thought, all right then. All right. They left on the 4th of January at first light. 7 men on horses in the kind of cold that made everything quiet, and the horse's breath came in great white plumes, and the sound of the hooves on the frozen ground carried further than it should have. Lillian stood at the kitchen window with Hazel on her hip and watched them go. Silas was at the front. She could identify him at a distance now, the particular way he sat a horse, upright and economical, no wasted motion. He didn't look back. She turned from the window and got to work. The first 2 days were fine, cold but manageable, which was what Montana offered in January as the best-case scenario. She kept the fires and fed the colt. His name, she learned from the notes Hector had left on the kitchen table, was Bishop, which she thought was a peculiar name for a horse, but Hector had not asked her opinion, and she walked the perimeter of the main barn morning and evening, checking the stock, doing what needed to be done. Hazel was cheerful and investigative in the way she had gotten as she approached 10 months, pulling herself up on things and examining them closely before letting go and sitting back down with an expression of scientific satisfaction. Carl had finished his whittling before they left. He'd set the result on the kitchen table without comment the morning they rode out. A small wooden horse, rough in the way of something made by an old man's hands rather than a craftsman's, but identifiable and solid, with 4 legs that were slightly different lengths, so it rocked when you set it on a flat surface. He'd put it on the corner of the table and walked out, and Lillian had picked it up and looked at it and felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. She set it in the crate with Hazel. Hazel was extremely interested in it. On the 3rd day, the sky changed. She noticed it mid-morning, the specific way the light went flat, and the wind shifted around to come from the northwest. Not the usual northwest either, but something harder and more deliberate than the January wind she'd gotten used to. The temperature was dropping fast, faster than it had dropped on any day since she'd arrived. She checked the shutters on the northwest window the way Hector had told her. She brought in 3 extra loads of wood and stacked them in the mudroom. She checked the stove in the main room and the one in her back room and the kitchen range and confirmed they were all drawing properly and had enough fuel to go through the night. Then she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the sky and thought about 7 men somewhere in the ridge breaks north of the ranch and the way the clouds were sitting on the peaks like something heavy had been set down on them. By noon, the wind was making the house talk. Not the ordinary winter wind sounds she'd gotten used to, the creaking of the eaves and the soft percussion of frozen branches, but something that was genuinely trying to get in. She felt it in the floors, a faint vibration.
She watched the temperature outside drop through the small thermometer mounted on the porch post, and the needle was moving in a direction and at a pace that made her stop being merely observant and start being actively concerned. She put Hazel in the crate by the stove with the wooden horse and a pot lid, which was Hazel's current favorite object, and she stood in the middle of the kitchen and she thought. They were out there. 3 days minimum, Hector had said. Could be 5. This was day 3, and whatever was coming from the northwest was not a normal January cold front. She had grown up in Missouri, where the weather had opinions but not convictions. This was something else. This was Montana in January deciding to show you what it actually was. She thought about what Hector had told her. He's not a man who asks for help easily. He'd manage it himself before he'd send for help. She thought about the distance between the ridge breaks and the ranch, which she estimated at 12 or 15 miles, across terrain that was going to become very different terrain very quickly once that sky did what she thought it was going to do. She went to the main room and built the fire up past what it needed to be just for the room. She dragged the heavy rug from in front of the hearth and laid down the wool blankets she found in the cedar chest under the window. 4 of them, old but solid. She went to the pantry and pulled out everything that could be made into food quickly. Dried beans, cornmeal, the last of the beef from the smokehouse, onions, potatoes, the smoked pork. She started a pot of beans on the back burner because beans took the longest and she wanted them ready. She put water on to heat. She did all of this quickly and without panic, which was not because she wasn't frightened. She was, in the specific, practical way of someone who has assessed a situation and found it serious, but because panic is not useful, and she had learned that in June in a hospital room in Butte, and she had not unlearned it since. By mid-afternoon, the blizzard hit. There was no gradual worsening. 1 minute the snow was coming down hard and steady in the way it had been since late morning, and then the wind came up like something thrown, and suddenly the world outside the kitchen window was white. Not snow white, not the ordinary white of a heavy snowfall, just white, total, and complete. A whiteout that erased the barn 30 yards away as completely as if it had never existed. The sound was enormous. She had not understood until that moment that snow could be loud. It came at the house from the northwest in a sustained horizontal force that found every imperfection in the structure and made it audible. The windows flexed, the front door rattled in its frame despite the bar across it. The chimney in the main room howled at a pitch that was almost human. Hazel looked at the ceiling with wide eyes and said something emphatic and wordless. "I know," Lillian said. "Me too." She went back to her work. She made soup from the beef and the bones and the onions and let it go on the front burner while the beans worked on the back. She cut the salt pork into a pan for later. She put bread on to rise, 2 loaves, because men coming in from cold that severe would need every calorie she could give them. She filled every pot and basin she had with water from the pump before the cold could freeze the line, setting them near the stove. She found the medical kit in the mudroom, a battered tin box with bandaging and iodine, and a bottle of something the label identified as a liniment for deep cold exposure, and she read the label and set it on the kitchen shelf where she could find it. She did all of this. And between tasks, she checked on Hazel, and between checks on Hazel, she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the white nothing outside and could not see the barn at all. She did not allow herself to think about 12 or 15 miles of that. She did not allow herself to think about a man who would manage it himself before he'd ask for help. She put more wood in the stove and made sure the draft was set right and went back to the soup. Night came early. In January, the dark came down by 5 in the afternoon anyway, and on a blizzard day it came down earlier than that, the light just giving up and going somewhere else. She lit every lamp she had, and she kept the fires high in both the kitchen and the main room, and she put Hazel to bed in the back room with extra blankets, and she sat in the kitchen with the pot of soup on the low burner, keeping warm, and she waited. She had not felt this particular quality of alone since the hospital in Butte. She worked on the mending she always kept near the chair, and she watched the window, and she listened to the storm. It was not consistent. It came in waves, each one seeming to decide it would be the loudest, and then the next one arrived and redefined loudest in a way the previous one had not anticipated. The house held. It was an old house, built by someone who had understood Montana winters, and it held, but it made its opinions about the situation known throughout the night. At some point, she must have slept.
She woke in the chair with the mending in her lap, and the fire low, and the kitchen dark except for the orange glow from the stove's vents. And for a disorienting moment, she did not know where she was. Then she did know, and she got up and put wood in the stove and built it back up, and she stood at the window. The wind had dropped. Not stopped, but dropped, from that sustained howling force to something that was merely severe. She could see the barn. It was half buried in a drift on its north side that had not been there yesterday, a smooth white slope that came to the eave, but the structure itself was there and the light she'd left burning inside was still visible in the one small window. She checked the clock, past 4 in the morning. She started the fire higher and put the soup back on the front burner to heat properly, and she started fresh biscuits because the bread from yesterday was for eating now, and she needed something for coming in cold with, something fast and hot. She put the coffee on. She got the medical kit from the shelf and set it open on the counter where she could reach it without looking. She put the wool blankets from the main room near the kitchen stove to warm them. She did not know if they were alive. She did not allow herself to think in those terms. She thought in the terms of what needed to be ready when they came in. Because if she began thinking in terms of if, the morning would not work the way the morning needed to work. The coffee came to boil, and she poured a cup and stood at the kitchen window with it and watched the lightening sky. She heard them before she saw them. She heard the horses first, the particular sound of animals that have been working through something difficult and are close enough to shelter that they know it. A changed quality in their movement, something between relief and the last effort required. She went to the door and opened it. In the gray early light, against the white of the yard, 7 figures on horses were coming through the gate, coming slowly. The horses were laboring in snow that was chest deep in the drifts, and the men on them were shapes rather than people, so bundled in whatever they'd had out there that it took her a moment to count them. She counted twice. 7. She let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 14 hours. They came into the yard and Hector was down first, because Hector was always first at the practical things, and he started taking horses, and she could hear him talking to them in the low, authoritative way he had, calm and steady, even after whatever he'd just been through. Eddie Marsh fell off his horse and caught himself on the fence and stood there for a moment, head down. She recognized that posture. The posture of someone who has made it to the end of a thing they were not sure they could make it to the end of, and is now renegotiating the terms of remaining upright. Roy Calloway had his arm around his brother's shoulders. Dex was moving, but his movement was wrong, slow and uncoordinated, and Lillian filed that immediately as cold exposure, serious, and moved her eyes to the next man. Carl, on his feet, listing slightly. Anders Lindqvist, enormous and ice-crusted from hat brim to boot soles, standing at his horse's head and speaking to it softly. Silas Boone was last through the gate. He was still mounted, which was the only good thing she could say about his condition. His horse stopped in the middle of the yard and stood there, and Silas sat on it in a way that was not how Silas sat a horse. He sat a horse with the economy of a man who had done it his whole life, upright and controlled. He was not sitting that way now. He was sitting the way you sit when staying on is the thing you are using the last of something to accomplish. She left the porch. "Get them inside," she said to Hector as she passed him. "Main room, fire's built up, coffee's on." She was already at Silas's horse, already reaching up. "I can," Silas said. His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, blurred. "You can inside," she said. "Right now, come down." "The horse, Anders has the horse. Come down, Mr. Boone." He came down. Not gracefully. He got one foot out of the stirrup and leaned toward her, and she got her shoulder under his arm and took more of his weight than she expected. He was heavy in the way of a large man whose body had stopped cooperating, and she set her feet and held him. "All right," she said, low. "Walk." He walked. She walked with him, his arm over her shoulder, across the yard and up the porch steps and through the door. She put him in the chair nearest the kitchen stove, which was the hottest room. The other men had come in behind them, Hector herding them efficiently through the main room, getting them out of their outer layers, getting them near the fire. But Silas was in the kitchen, and Lillian was focused entirely on that. His hands were the first concern. She peeled the gloves off, stiff, ice-stiffened, and looked at the fingers, white at the tips of the right hand, less so on the left. Not black, which was the thing she was checking for. She put his hands between both of hers and held them. "That's going to hurt," she said. "I know," he said. His voice was still blurred, but more present than it had been outside. "Good," she said. "Hurting is good right now." He made a sound that might have been something wry, hard to tell. She worked the blood back into his fingers slowly, the way you did it, not rubbing. Rubbing was the wrong instinct. Just holding, warming them gradually. He sat still and let her. That in itself told her more about how the last 24 hours had been than anything he could have said. "The cattle?" she asked, partly to give him something to focus on, partly because she actually wanted to know. "Found most of them, 160 maybe. The rest are—" He stopped, took a breath. "Gone. Can't be helped." "No?" "We got down to the Halstead Creek shelter about noon yesterday, when it really came in." His voice was steadying, the sentences getting more coherent as the warmth got into him. Hector had the sense to call it, "Early enough we made it before the worst of it. Spent the night in the creek shelter. 12 hours in a line shack." "It's been worse." "I believe you." She moved to the other hand, checked the left fingers. "Better." Dex Calloway. His movement when he came in, he was the last one into the shelter, got turned around in the whiteout for about 20 minutes before Roy found him. Silas's voice tightened slightly at that. "He's going to be fine. He'd better be fine." "He will be. Get his core temperature up, get hot food into him. He'll be fine." She said it with the certainty of someone who intended it to be true. "The liniment on the counter is for the hands. I'll do them properly once yours are—" "Lillian?" He said her name. He had not, she realized, said her name before. It was always Mrs. Cross. The use of her given name stopped her for just a second. "The men first. My hands are fine." She looked at him. His color was coming back, the gray receding. His eyes were more present now, more like themselves. That watchful, calibrated quality he had, taking everything in. "Your hands first," she said, "because you can't help them if yours aren't working, and because you're the one I'm looking at right now." He held her gaze for a moment, then he looked at the stove. "All right," he said. She went back to work. Bong. The next hour was the kind of hour that existed only in very specific circumstances. The hour after a thing has almost gone badly, and you are handling the business of that. She moved between the kitchen and the main room, soup and coffee and biscuits going out, wet layers coming off, blankets going around shoulders. Hector, who had apparently been through things like this before, and had the constitution of a geological formation, was managing the men with the same methodical quiet he brought to everything. Carl sat in front of the main room fire with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup and his eyes closed, and she could see his color coming back slowly. Dex Calloway was on the settle near the fire with his boots off, and Roy next to him, and Lillian checked Dex's feet with the same attention she'd given Silas's hands and found what she needed to find. Pain, which meant feeling, which meant he was all right. "Ow," said Dex. "Good," she said. "That doesn't seem right," he said. "Trust me." She went back to the kitchen. Silas was still in the chair by the stove. He had a bowl of soup in his hands now, both hands, and he was eating it the way he'd eaten that first bowl of stew on the first night she'd stayed, with that private, concentrated attention. He looked up when she came in. "The men?" he said. "All right, Dex needs to stay off those feet for the day. Keep them warm. Carl needs sleep. Eddie's already—" She glanced toward the hall, where a faint sound suggested Eddie Marsh had found somewhere horizontal. "He's managed." Silas let out a breath. Something in him settled visibly, a weight set down. "You were ready," he said. "I had time to prepare." Not everyone would have. He looked at the soup bowl. The fires, the food, the blankets warmed. He said it like he was making a list, cataloging what he'd walked into. "You had the medical kit out." "Yes." "Before you knew the state of things. Before you knew if anyone needed it." "I knew someone might." He was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did you start?" "Yesterday afternoon, when I saw the sky change."
She poured herself coffee because she needed it badly and sat down across the table from him because her legs had just informed her that the last 16 hours had in fact occurred. There wasn't much else to do. Either you came back or you didn't. I couldn't change that. I could change what you came back to. He looked at her across the table. The kitchen was warm, genuinely warm, the stove doing what she'd asked it to do all night. And outside the window, the storm had moved south, and the sky was the particular pale, clear blue of a Montana morning after a hard weather, and the sun was coming up on all that snow and making it hurt to look at. "Thank you," he said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "You're welcome." It wasn't enough, what he'd said, and they both knew it. It wasn't enough, because thank you was the word you used for ordinary things. And what had passed in this house in the last 16 hours was not ordinary. But neither of them had the language yet for what it actually was. So thank you was what they had, and it sat on the table between them like something that would have to do. "My wife used to do that," he said. He said it quietly, not looking at the table or the stove or her. Looking at some point between all of those things. Look at the sky and know. She'd start preparing for weather a day ahead, sometimes two. I always thought she was being... He stopped. I didn't always appreciate it the way I should have. The kitchen held that. Lillian didn't say anything. She understood that he wasn't talking to her exactly. He was talking out loud about something he had carried in silence for a long time. And that was a different thing, and required a different response, which was not a response at all, but just the willingness to be present while it was said. "She sounds like she was practical," Lillian said finally, carefully. "She was." He looked at the soup bowl. "She was a lot of things." "I know." She said it simply. "Carl told me. A little. I hope it's fine." He said it quickly, and then more slowly, as if reconsidering the word. "It's fine. People talk." He was quiet for a moment. "She'd have liked you." That landed unexpectedly. She felt it hit somewhere in her chest, not unpleasantly, just the landing of something true, said plainly. "I think I'd have liked her," she said. "Given the garden." His face changed slightly. The first genuine thing she'd seen on it that wasn't controlled, a movement at the corner of his mouth that was grief and something else. The two of them mixed in a way that looked like neither one separately. "The seeds are still good," he said. "I checked them last fall." "I know you did." She looked at her coffee cup. "You saved them every year." He didn't confirm or deny that. He looked at the window, at the blue sky and the white ground, and she looked at her coffee, and the stove made the sound it made when it was hitting its best temperature. From the main room came the low sound of men settling into the specific unconsciousness of the deeply exhausted, the sounds of sleep that is not chosen, but claimed. Outside, somewhere near the barn, she could hear Hector's voice talking to the horses the way he always did, steady and low, putting the morning back in order, one task at a time. Silas Boone set the empty soup bowl on the table. He looked at his hands. At the right hand, the fingers that had been white when she'd stripped the glove off in the yard, which were now only slightly pink and fully present. He opened and closed them once. "I should check on," he started. "Hector has it," she said. "Sit down." He stopped. He sat back down. She got up and refilled his coffee cup without asking, and she refilled her own, and she sat back across from him. And for a while they didn't say anything else at all, which was the first time she could remember that the silence between them had not been the silence of two people who didn't know each other well enough to speak, but the silence of two people who had simply run out of the need to. Outside the window, January settled back into itself, quieter now, the storm somewhere south and getting smaller. The ranch lay under its new snow like something remade, the familiar shapes altered and softened, the fences half disappeared, the barn with its ridiculous drift on the north side, the water tower standing clear because the wind had scoured it clean. She thought about the tin box on the pantry shelf. She thought about spring, still months away, still hypothetical, still a thing that required winter to finish its business first. She put both hands around her coffee cup. Silas Boone sat across the table from her, and outside the window the world was white and silent and very still, and somewhere in the back room Hazel was beginning to wake up, making the small purposeful sounds of a person who has slept well and has decided that the morning should now begin. The days after the blizzard had a particular quality to them, the quality of aftermath, which is different from ordinary time. Things moved more slowly. Men who had spent a night in a line shack in a Montana whiteout did not immediately return to their full operational capacity, regardless of what they believed about themselves. And Lillian watched the ranch hands move through the following week with the careful deliberateness of people who had been reminded of something fundamental and were still processing the reminder. Dex Calloway stayed off his feet for 2 days, which he endured poorly. He was not a man built for stillness, and by the second afternoon he was sitting on the settle in the main room with his bandaged feet on a stool and an expression of aggressive dissatisfaction aimed at the middle distance. "You could read," Lillian said, passing through with a stack of folded laundry. "I don't have anything to read." "There's a shelf of books in the hall. I counted 11. "Ranch books," he said, with a dismissiveness that suggested he had investigated and found them wanting. "There's a novel, third from the left. It's about a sea voyage." She kept walking. "It's actually quite good." She heard him get up, carefully, favoring the right foot, and shuffle toward the hall. She didn't look back. Roy came in from the barn that afternoon and found his brother on the settle with the novel open across his knee, reading with the specific frowning attention of someone who had not expected to be interested and was annoyed to find themselves so. Roy looked at Lillian in the kitchen doorway. She shrugged. He almost smiled. These were small things. The texture of the days after was made of small things, which was how you knew a household was actually functioning rather than just operating, when the small things had room to exist. Silas Boone moved through that week differently than he had before the blizzard. She noticed it without being able to say precisely what had changed. He was not more talkative. He remained a man of considerable economy when it came to words, but something in his quality of presence in the house was altered. He came into the kitchen more, not for meals, which had always been a reliable appearance, but in between. He'd come through on his way to the mudroom and stop for a minute at the stove. He'd come in from the barn and pour himself coffee and stand at the window with it instead of taking it back outside. Once she came into the kitchen at mid-morning and found him at the table not doing anything, not eating, not reading, not working through whatever practical problem was usually visible in his expression. Just sitting. He got up when she came in. "I was just," he started. "Coffee's hot," she said, and went to the pantry to get what she'd come for. And when she came back, he was gone. She didn't remark on it. She filed it in the same place she filed the woodpile and the replaced window glass and the sealed floorboards, in the category of things Silas Boone said without saying anything, which was apparently the primary language of the man. Hazel turned 10 months old in the second week of January and celebrated by pulling herself upright against the side of her crate, standing unsupported for the first time for approximately 4 seconds, before sitting back down with a look of tremendous personal satisfaction. Lillian was at the stove and caught it in her peripheral vision and turned fully around just in time for the 4 seconds and then the sitting down. "Did you see that?" she said to the empty kitchen. The kitchen was in fact empty. She looked at the door to the hall, then back at Hazel, who had achieved upright again and was now examining the wooden horse Carl had made with the focused attention of someone reconsidering a previous assessment of a familiar object. "You did that," Lillian said. "You just stood up." Hazel was not particularly interested in discussing it. She had moved on to the pot lid. Lillian stood at the stove for a moment longer than she needed to, the things she'd been doing forgotten in her hands, thinking about Thomas, who had wanted very badly to see this. He'd said it once, in the hospital room, in the last week, when the conversation had moved, the way conversations do in those rooms, from the immediate and practical to the unguarded. He'd said, "I just want to see her walk." That was all he'd said about it. One sentence, and then he'd looked out the window at the Butte skyline, which was not beautiful, but was something to look at. And she'd held his hand and they hadn't talked about it anymore. She stood at the stove with the forgotten thing in her hands and let herself feel that for a moment, the full weight of it. Then she put the thing down and went and picked up Hazel and held her tightly enough that Hazel protested. And she stood in the middle of the warm kitchen in January in Montana and just held her daughter until the feeling had passed through her and out the other side. "All right," she said, to both of them. She told Silas about it at supper that evening, which surprised her, not because it was the wrong thing to tell him, but because she hadn't planned to. And she was not a woman who did things she hadn't planned. It came out sideways, the way things often did in conversation when you were talking about something else. They were at the table after the men had gone out, the kitchen quiet, and he'd asked about Hazel in the general way he'd begun asking, not because he needed information, but because it had become part of the evening's conversation, which had itself become a thing that existed between them, this modest exchange at the end of the day. "She stood up today," Lillian said. "First time." He looked up from the bowl. "Holding on to the crate side," she said. 4 seconds, maybe. "That's early, isn't it?" "A little. Some babies do it at 10 months. She moved the spoon in the bowl without eating. Her father wanted to see her walk. He said so specifically, in the hospital. She hadn't intended to say that part. She looked at the table. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas?" he said. That was his name. "Yes." "What was he like?" She looked up. Nobody had asked her that. In all the months since June, nobody, not her mother, not the women from the miner's aid who had come with casseroles, not the lawyer who'd handled the estate, had asked her what Thomas was like. They had asked how she was managing and whether she had family nearby and what her plans were, but no one had asked what he was like, as if he were a person worth knowing about. She found she had to think about how to answer, not because she didn't know, but because the question had so many possible entries. "Stubborn," she said, "about the wrong things and not about the right ones. He could argue about the best road into town for 20 minutes and then turn around and decide in 30 seconds to take a job in a mine he'd never worked in before in a town he'd never been to." She paused. "He was funny, genuinely funny, not the kind that's trying. He could make me laugh in the middle of an argument, which I resented." She looked at the bowl. "He was good with his hands, good with people, bad with money, not reckless, just optimistic, which amounts to the same thing." Silas was listening in the way he listened to everything, fully, without rushing it. "He loved Hazel from the first minute," she said. "He was terrified of her for the first 3 days, and then he just decided she was the best thing that had ever happened. He was like that. Made up his mind about things, and then that was it." She stopped. Her voice had gone somewhere she hadn't intended to take it. She steadied it. "He was 31 years old. He'd been in that mine for 4 months. "I'm sorry," Silas said. "I know." She meant it. She could tell from the way he said it that he meant it too, not as a social response, but as a statement from someone who understood loss as a specific and not a general condition. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was the same lamp it always was, the same table, the same kitchen, but something in the quality of the moment was different from all the previous evenings. More exposed, maybe. Like the weather after the blizzard, when the snow had taken everything extra away and left the landscape in an unfamiliar clarity. "Tell me about Margaret," she said. She said it simply, without apology. She could see the word land on him. Not badly, but with weight. He looked at the table for a long moment. "She was from Virginia," he said. "Came out here with her family when she was 16. They had a place about 40 miles east of here that didn't make it past the second winter. Her father went back east." "She didn't." He paused. "I met her at a supply run in Harlan. She was trying to convince the supply man he'd shorted her on flour, and she was right, and she was not going to let it go until he acknowledged it." Something moved across his face. "I thought that was about the finest thing I'd ever seen." Lillian didn't say anything. "She was better at this than I am," he said. The gesture he made with his hand was small but encompassing. The house, the ranch, all of it. At the human parts of it. "I can run the land. I understand the land." She understood the people. The men respected her differently than they respected me, because she paid attention to them in a way I don't always think to. He stopped. "When she died, the ranch kept running. Everything kept running. That's the thing about necessary work. It requires you whether you're ready or not." He looked at the window. "But it was different. The house was different." "I know what you mean," Lillian said. "I think you might." They sat with that for a moment. "William was 4, he said. He used to come into the kitchen in the mornings and pull on Hector's trouser leg because Hector was tallest and therefore the most interesting to small people, apparently." His voice was completely level, the way voices are when they are being held level by a significant effort. "He'd been doing it for about a year. Hector never said anything about it. He'd just look down and then go back to his coffee. He stopped. Hector used to come to the kitchen anyway, at the same time, for a while. Lillian thought about Hector Torres crouching in front of Hazel's crate, making a face at a baby before quickly becoming Hector Torres, the foreman again. She didn't say that. She just sat with what Silas had said. I didn't leave the ranch for about a year, he said. Didn't see the point of going anywhere. Work is work, it's the same everywhere, but here at least I knew exactly what every acre looked like and what it needed. It's a manageable thing, when other things aren't manageable. He looked at his hands. I think I've been doing that ever since, making manageable things. Like the woodpile, she said. He looked up. Like fixing the window, she said. The pantry hinge. The floorboards in the kitchen. He didn't confirm or deny any of it. He just looked at her in a way that was neither defensive nor vulnerable, but simply direct. The look of someone who has been seen accurately and is deciding what to do with that. You saved the seeds, she said. Yes. Every year. Yes. The kitchen held that. I don't think that's a manageable thing, she said carefully. I think that's something else. He looked at the table for a long time. No, he said finally. I suppose it isn't. February came in without the violence of January and settled into a cold that was comprehensive rather than aggressive. The kind of cold that wasn't trying to prove anything, just existing, a fact of the season like the short days and the early dark. The ranch moved through it in the rhythm Lillian had come to understand as its natural one. The work, the meals, the brief evenings, the sleep of people who have used their bodies all day. She started the seeds in late February, not planting them. That would wait for proper spring, still weeks away, but starting the ones that needed the longest lead time in small pots set on the south-facing windowsill of the main room, where the afternoon sun came in longest. Tomatoes and the sweet peas from the envelope with Margaret's name on it. She did it on a Sunday morning when the house was quiet, and the men were in the bunkhouse and Silas was out doing whatever Silas did in the mornings that he never fully explained. She set the pots in the window and stood back and looked at them. 12 small clay pots in a row on the sill, filled with the good dark soil she'd found in the garden beds, and she thought about the woman who had labeled those envelopes. The careful handwriting. The word Margaret's added by someone else after, so no one would forget. She heard the front door, and then Silas in the hall, and then he stopped. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway of the main room looking at the windowsill. His coat was still on. He hadn't moved past the threshold. She waited. Margaret's sweet peas take about 8 weeks to establish, he said. His voice was doing the level thing again. They need something to climb when you put them out. She used to run twine up the south wall of the kitchen garden. I'll need twine then, Lillian said. I've got some in the barn. All right. He stood there for another moment, looking at the pots on the sill in a way she didn't try to read. Then he went on to the kitchen. She heard him pour himself coffee and go to the mudroom. She turned back to the window. Outside, February lay flat and white and unvarying as far as she could see, and the sky was that pale winter blue of altitude and cold, and the afternoon sun was coming in at a low angle and hitting those 12 small pots and making them look like something planted in a field of light. She found the cradle on a Wednesday. She wasn't looking for it. She'd gone to the barn to check on Bishop, whose mysterious malaise had finally resolved itself into nothing more alarming than a mild respiratory issue that Hector had treated with a steam treatment and considerable grumbling. And she'd taken the wrong turn past the tack room and come around the corner into the back section of the barn she didn't usually have reason to enter. It was on a sawbuck, half finished. Pine, from the look of it, the joint still open at one end, a side rail not yet fitted. The shape of it was clear, though. The curved rockers, the slated sides, the proportions of something built for a baby rather than a child. Someone had been working on it for a while. The finished portions had a smoothness to them that came from accumulated sanding, not a quick pass. She stood and looked at it for a moment. Hector came around the corner behind her and stopped when he saw her standing there. She looked at him. He looked at the cradle, then at the middle distance over her shoulder. Hector, she said. I don't know anything about that, he said. You absolutely do.
He pressed his mouth together and looked at the ceiling of the barn, which was apparently very interesting to him. He started it in November, he said, in the manner of a man who has calculated that minimal admission is less costly than continued denial. Before you got here, he stopped. There was a family, last spring, passed through on the way to Oregon. They stopped for a night. They had a baby, had an accident, their wagon, and the cradle broke. We fixed the wagon, but the cradle was past saving. He had William's old one in the attic. He gave it to them. He paused.
Then in November, he started making a new one. I don't know who he thought it was for. Lillian looked at the half-finished cradle on the sawbuck. The wood was pale and smelled of fresh pine, and the rockers were already fitted, and she could see, running her eye along the line of it, that it was going to be well made, built by someone who was taking their time with it. Don't tell him you saw it, Hector said. I won't, she said. She went to check on Bishop, who was fine, and she came back to the kitchen and she made supper, and she did not say anything to Silas Boone about what she had seen in the back of the barn. And she also did not say anything about the fact that she stood at the kitchen window for a long time after supper, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about a man who started building a cradle in November for a baby he didn't yet know was coming. Oh, the hardest conversation happened at the end of February, on an evening that had started ordinarily and then quietly become something else. She had been on her feet since before 5, and the day had been the particular kind of exhausting that accumulated from many small things rather than one large one. And by the time supper was done and Hazel was put down and the kitchen was clean, she was the specific tired that lived behind the eyes and made everything feel slightly further away than it was. She was sitting in her chair by the stove with the mending she no longer had the energy to actually do when Silas came in. He sat down across the table without asking, which he had stopped doing weeks ago. Asking. He just sat down now, the way people do in a room they've stopped treating as someone else's. You had a hard day, he said. Not a question. I'm fine. I didn't say you weren't. I said you had a hard day. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the direct attention he usually reserved for things that required assessment. It occurred to her that he was assessing her right now, and that he had been for a while, and that he was not the kind of man who assessed things without having a reason. I'm tired, she said. That's all. All right. He didn't go anywhere. He poured himself coffee and set the pot where she could reach it. She picked it up and poured her own. I've been thinking, he said. She waited. About the spring drive. He looked at the cup. We pushed the herd south in April. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Hector runs it mostly. I go along because he stopped, reformulated. I've always gone along because there wasn't a reason to stay. She was still. This year there's a reason, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm not saying that clearly, he said. You're saying it clearly enough, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The lamp between them was doing what lamps do, which is throw light on whatever is closest and leave everything else in relative shadow, and what was closest was both of them, and neither of them looked away. I don't know how to do this, he said. It cost him something to say it. She could see that plainly. I did it once, and I knew how because I was 28 years old, and I thought not knowing how to do something was a reason to try it rather than a reason to stop. Now I'm older and I know what it costs. He paused. I know what it costs when it goes wrong. So do I, she said. I know you do. He set the cup down. That's why I'm saying it to you instead of someone who doesn't. She thought about Thomas in the hospital room saying, I just want to see her walk. She thought about a tin box with seed envelopes organized in someone else's handwriting. She thought about a half-finished cradle in the back of the barn, pale pine, smelling of fresh wood. I'm afraid of it, she said, plainly. Not ashamed of it, just stating it. Yes, he said. Me too. That's not... She stopped. That's not a good reason not to do things. I know that. I've done a lot of things I was afraid of. I got on a stagecoach to nowhere with a baby in my arms, and a letter I'd read so many times the paper was going soft. I was afraid of that. She looked at the cup. But this is different. How? She thought about it honestly, because if that went wrong, it was my problem. Mine and Hazel's. She glanced toward the back room. This is other people's lives. Yours, your men, the ranch. She paused. You've built this, all of it, for 20 years or whatever it's been. I don't want to be a... She searched for the word. A disruption to that. He was quiet for a moment. You've been here since December, he said. Yes. What's been disrupted? She opened her mouth and closed it. The only thing that's been disrupted, he said, is the particular way I'd organize things so that nothing could go wrong, which is another way of saying nothing could matter. I was very good at it. He looked at the table. I was also lonely. I've been lonely for 7 years and I got used to it because you can get used to anything if you don't give yourself a choice. He looked up at her. You gave me a choice, just by being here. That's not a disruption. That's the opposite of one. Lillian Cross sat in her chair by the stove and looked at Silas Boone across a kitchen table in Montana in February and felt the full, complicated weight of a life that had broken and was considering whether to try to make something new from the pieces. It didn't feel like a fairy story. It felt like something more honest than that. Two people who had both lost something irreplaceable and who were sitting in a warm kitchen at the end of a hard day, talking about whether loss was a thing you carried forever alone or a thing you could eventually set down in the presence of another person without it meaning you had forgotten what you lost. I'm not the same as I was before Thomas, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not starting from where I started. I come with... She gestured, a small, frustrated movement that tried to encompass everything. All of this. So do I, he said. So does everyone who's gotten somewhere worth starting from. She looked at him for a long time. The spring drive, she said. April, he said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. You said there wasn't a reason to stay before. That's right. And now there is. That's what I said. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It was almost cold. She drank it anyway. Silas, she said. It was the first time she had used his name without the mister. She saw him register it. Ask me something directly. I'm tired and I don't want to work for the question. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him deciding, in that way he had, measuring the cost of a thing against the cost of not doing it. Will you still be here when I get back? He said. From the drive. Is this... He paused. Is this where you're staying? It was not the most elegant question she had ever been asked. It was also one of the most honest, and she valued honest over elegant on account of having learned the difference between the two. She thought about the seeds in the window, the sweet peas with the name on the envelope, the garden under the snow with its deep beds and its careful structure, waiting for April the way things waited in winter. Not passively, but with the stored energy of things that intended to grow. The sweet peas need planting in April, she said. He looked at her. Someone needs to put up the twine on the south wall of the kitchen garden, she said, for them to climb. Something happened in his face. Not a smile exactly. He was not a man who smiled easily, and she had not in 3 months seen him do it fully, but the precursor to one. Something that changed the lines around his eyes and the set of his mouth into something she hadn't seen there before. I'll put the twine up before I leave, he said. See that you do, she said. They sat in the kitchen a little while longer, not talking much, the stove doing its work, and the house settled around them in the particular quiet of a Montana night. And outside the window, February was still February, still cold, still white, still the long middle of a season that had further to go before it was done. But the pots on the south sill of the main room had the smallest imaginable green at the soil line. She'd checked that morning, said nothing about it. And the days were getting marginally longer in the way of late February, and somewhere in the back of the barn a cradle sat half-finished on a sawbuck, waiting for someone to finish it. When Silas finally got up to go, he stopped in the doorway. Lillian, he said. She looked up. He stood there for a moment like he had more to say, and was deciding if it needed saying tonight or if tonight had already held enough. Good night, he said. Good night, she said. He went down the hall. She sat in the chair until the stove needed another piece of wood, and then she put one in, and she checked on Hazel, who was sleeping with both arms flung wide in the absolute abandon of a child who has no doubts about the safety of where she is, and Lillian stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she went to bed. Outside, the last of February lay cold and silent and full of everything that was coming, and the night was very clear, the stars hard and bright,
the way they got in that country when the temperature dropped, and the air had nothing left in it but cold and light. And the ranch sat under all of it, quiet and waiting, accumulating spring the way the ground accumulated warmth in those last weeks of winter, secretly, invisibly, in ways you couldn't yet see but that were happening all the same, under everything, in the dark. March came in muddy. That was the honest truth of a Montana spring. It did not arrive like something beautiful. It arrived like a slow argument between winter and everything else, conducted over the course of weeks in alternating days of false warmth and hard freeze, the snow retreating by inches and then coming back to reclaim what it had given up, the ground going soft in the afternoons and iron hard again by morning. The yard at Black Ridge became, for several weeks, a study in mud. Deep, committed mud that took boots with it if you weren't paying attention, that accumulated on every porch step and followed the men into the mudroom in quantities that made Lillian's twice-daily sweeping feel like a philosophical position rather than a practical one. She did not mind it. She had never been a woman who needed things to be pretty in order to find them good. Mud meant thaw. Thaw meant the ground was waking up, doing the slow, invisible work that ground does before it's willing to take seeds. She watched it the way she'd watched the sky all winter, as information, as something that was telling her what came next. What came next, in early March, was that the sweet peas on the south windowsill of the main room grew their second set of leaves. She noticed it on a Tuesday, coming through the main room with a basket of laundry, and she stopped and stood in front of the window in the thin morning light and looked at the 12 small pots and the green in them, the real substantive green of plants that had decided to commit. She stood there for longer than she intended. Carl Pruitt came through the hall behind her and stopped. "Those going to be flowers?" he said. "Sweet peas, in about 8 weeks, if everything goes right." He looked at them the way he looked at most things, steadily, without rush. "Margaret grew those," he said. "I know. Along the south wall of the kitchen garden, every summer." He was quiet for a moment. Used to smell like something when the wind came off the mountain in the afternoon. He looked at the window, not the pots. "Haven't smelled that in 7 years. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. After a moment, he went on to the kitchen for his morning coffee, and she stood a little longer with the basket on her hip and then followed him. What she thought about, standing at the stove while the coffee heated, was something she hadn't let herself think about directly until that morning. The fact that healing was not a private event. It happened in the presence of other people, or it didn't happen at all. You could think you were managing fine alone, could mistake the numbness of isolation for recovery, could confuse the absence of fresh pain with the presence of genuine repair. She had made that mistake herself in the months after Thomas died. She had kept moving, kept functioning, kept the mechanics of survival running so efficiently that she had not noticed until she was standing in a warm kitchen in Montana with sweet peas on the windowsill, that she had been bleeding quietly the entire time and had simply become accustomed to it. The ranch had stopped her bleeding, not through anything dramatic, not through a single moment of transformation, but through the accumulation of ordinary days, through hot coffee at 5 in the morning and the sound of men eating seriously, and Hazel on the floor of the kitchen talking to a wooden horse, and Carl at the table saying things sideways that were actually something else. Through a man who put wood outside a kitchen door without saying so, and fixed floors and saved seeds for 7 years as if waiting was a form of faithfulness. She poured the coffee and did not say any of this out loud, because some things are understood more clearly when they remain interior, and because Carl was reading the newspaper Hector had brought back from the supply run, and he did not need her philosophy with his morning coffee. Und. Silas finished the cradle on the 15th of March. She came back from the kitchen garden. She'd been turning the beds, working the soil with the fork she'd found in the barn, getting it ready, and found it in the kitchen. Not in the barn anymore, not on the sawbuck. In the kitchen, near the stove, in the corner where Hazel's crate had been since December. The crate was gone. The cradle was in its place, finished, the wood sanded to a pale smoothness, the joints tight, both rockers fitted, and even so that it moved without any catch or wobble when she put her hand to it. Hazel was in it. She had been put in it and given the pot lid and the wooden horse, and she was sitting up inside it. She had been sitting up unassisted for 3 weeks now, a development she seemed to find less impressive than the adults around her, examining the slated sides with her systematic attention. Silas was at the kitchen table with coffee, watching her examine it.
Lillian stood in the doorway with her coat still on and her gloves in her hand and dirt from the garden on her boots. And she looked at the cradle and at Hazel in it and at Silas at the table. And she did not say anything for a moment because there was a specific fullness in her chest that required a moment before it was safe to speak. "She fits," she said finally. "She won't for long," he said. "Few months, maybe. It's beautifully made." He looked at the coffee cup. "It's functional." "Silas." She said it the way she'd learned to say his name, which was without preamble. "It's beautifully made." He didn't argue further. He looked at Hazel, who had succeeded in making the cradle rock slightly by pushing at the slats, and seemed satisfied with this discovery. "The twine's up on the south wall," he said, "for the sweet peas. I did it yesterday." She looked at him. "Before the drive," he said, "like I said I would." She set her gloves on the counter and took off her coat. "When do you leave?" 2 weeks, April 4th, weather depending." 3 weeks, you said." 3 to 4. He looked at her steadily. "You said the sweet peas need planting in April." "First warm week, probably the 3rd week of April. I'll be back by then." "You said 3 to 4 weeks. I'll be back in 3. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. This was the kind of conversation they had now. Half practical, half something else entirely. The two registers running simultaneously in the same words. Like a piece of music with two things happening at once that somehow resolved into the same sound. "All right," she said, 3 weeks. He nodded once and went back to his coffee, and she went to check on the beans she had on the back burner, and Hazel rocked the cradle and found this enormously satisfying. And the kitchen was warm and smelled like good food and cut pine and the faint mineral smell of garden soil that had followed Lillian in on her boots. The 2 weeks before the drive had a particular texture to them, the texture of people who know a thing is coming and are moving toward it and not moving toward it simultaneously. The men were occupied with the practical work of preparing a cattle drive, checking gear, working the horses, counting and marking the herd, loading the supply wagon. The ranch had the heightened, purposeful energy of a place that knows what's expected of it. Silas was everywhere. That was the nature of the drive preparation. It required him in too many places at once, which was an organizational problem he solved by simply being in too many places at once. She saw him at breakfast and sometimes at supper, and in between she heard him in the barn or the yard or coming through the house on his way to something else. And the quality of his presence was the particular quality of a man who is occupied but not absent, which was different from how he had been in December. In December, he had been absent while present. The house around him had been a thing he moved through rather than inhabited. That was different now, and she wasn't sure when it had changed except that it had, somewhere between the blizzard and the sweet peas on the windowsill. On the evening of April 3rd, the night before the drive, she made a proper dinner. Not just supper, which was always good, but a dinner. A standing rib roast from the supply Hector had laid in. Roasted potatoes with herbs from the small pot of dried rosemary she'd kept going on the kitchen shelf, fresh bread, and a dried apple cake that Eddie Marsh ate 2 pieces of before he caught himself and put his fork down with the expression of a man exercising genuine moral discipline. "You don't have to stop," she said. He looked at the cake. "There's 7 of us." "I made 2. He picked up the fork. The table that night was loud in a way the Black Ridge table was not always loud. The Calloway brothers arguing about something that had been argued before and would be argued again. Anders Lindqvist contributing occasional observations in his deep, measured way that somehow made whatever was being argued seem less urgent. Hector eating with his usual focused efficiency and not saying much but present in the way he was always present, which was completely. Carl was at the end of the table cutting his roast with the care of a man who appreciates a good piece of meat, and he looked up once at Lillian when she came around with the bread and said very quietly, "This is a fine table, Mrs. Cross." And she said, "Thank you, Carl," and moved on, but she felt the weight of what he'd meant by it, which was more than the roast. Silas was at the head of the table. He ate, and he listened to the noise, and he said the occasional thing that redirected the conversation when it needed redirecting, and Lillian, moving between the table and the stove, watched him in the way she'd watched him all winter, without looking like she was watching, which was a skill she'd had for a long time. She watched him, and she thought that this was what he looked like when he was in a place he considered his Not the sharp, managed quality of a man holding something together by will, but the different quality of a man who was simply where he belonged. She thought about Thomas. She did that honestly, the way she'd learned to do it, not to avoid it and not to dwell in it, but to do it straight, like looking at something in a clear light. She thought about Thomas at their table in the house in Butte, which had been a small table and they had been the only two people at it, and how he had been loud enough for 6 people on his own, and how the small room had always felt full. She thought about him, and she let the grief of him be what it was, which was real and permanent, and also she had finally understood not incompatible with being here, with this table and these people and this man at the head of it. Grief did not leave. It changed shape. It went from being the weather to being something you carried, and the difference was that weather was what you were inside, and something you carried was something you had, and having it was not the same as being trapped by it. Thomas would have liked this ranch. That thought came to her out of nowhere, at the stove, with the coffee pot in her hand, and it was true and it didn't break her to think it, and she noted that without making much of it, and went to fill the cups. That's it. Satis. They left at first light on the 4th. 7 men, the herd, the supply wagon driven by a contract hand named Beale, who Hector had used before. The cattle went first, out through the north gate, moving south, the sound of them going, the lowing, the hooves, the particular low chaos of a herd in motion, carrying back to the house long after they'd disappeared from sight. Silas was last out of the yard. He'd stopped at the porch. She was standing on it with Hazel on her hip, same as she'd been when they left in January, and the similarity was not lost on her, the rhyme of it. He sat his horse at the gate and looked at her. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she said. He looked at Hazel. Hazel was watching the departing cattle with great interest, tracking them with the focused head tilt she used for things she found significant. She'll be walking by the time I get back, he said. Probably. Something in his face, not the almost smile of February, but the actual thing, brief and unguarded, there for a moment and then gone. Don't let Carl teach her card games, he said. Too late, she said. He's been showing her his hand since February. He shook his head once, something in it that was close to a laugh, and then he turned the horse and went through the gate, and she stood on the porch and watched him go. The yard was suddenly very quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a large departure, when a space adjusts to an absence. She stood in it for a moment. Then Hazel made an emphatic sound and reached for the porch post, and Lillian shifted her weight and said, "All right, let's go see about the garden," and went down the steps. Check. The 3 weeks were long and also not long, which is how time works when you're waiting for something you won't let yourself call waiting. She planted the sweet peas on the south wall in the 2nd week of April, on a morning when the temperature had finally committed to something above freezing for the 3rd consecutive day, pressing the seeds into the soil she'd prepared along the base of the wall where Silas had strung the twine before he left. She planted the tomatoes in the beds. She planted beans and squash and the radishes, and she stood back and looked at the turned soil of the kitchen garden and thought about Margaret, who had put those beds in and tended them and saved those seeds with her careful handwriting, and she felt no strangeness about it, only a kind of continuity, the sense of a thread picked up that had been set down, which was different from replacement and different from forgetting. Hazel took her first full unassisted steps on the 12th of April. She did it in the kitchen, which was where she did everything. The kitchen was the center of her world the way it was the center of Lillian's. And she did it between the cradle and the stove, which was a distance of perhaps 6 feet, and she made it 4 steps before she sat down hard on the floorboards and looked up at Lillian with an expression that was equal parts triumph and surprise, as if she had not quite believed her own hypothesis until it was proven. Carl was at the table. He looked at Hazel. He looked at Lillian. "Well," he said. "Well," said Lillian. Hazel stood back up and tried again. She made it 5 steps this time before the floor got the better of her. She sat down and made a sound that was clearly a statement of intent, and pulled herself upright against the stove leg, and tried again. Lillian watched her daughter learn to walk across the kitchen floor, and felt Thomas in the room with her in the way she sometimes did. Not his presence exactly, not anything she could explain, but the specific feeling of a thing witnessed by the right people regardless of where those people were. She did not try to explain it or make it something it wasn't.
She just stood at the stove and watched her daughter's 7th attempt and her 8th and her 9th, and let it be exactly what it was.
Carl got up from the table and went to the other side of the kitchen and crouched down at Hazel's level and held out a hand. And Hazel looked at the hand and at Carl and made the executive decision to aim for it. And she walked 6 steps into the kitchen and got her fist around his finger and held on. And Carl said very quietly, something in his throat that was not quite a word, and patted her hand once with his other hand, and Lillian turned back to the stove and did not mention it. Bye-bye.
Silas came back on the 23rd of April, 3 weeks to the day. She heard the horses before she saw them, coming down from the north in the late afternoon. And she was in the kitchen garden with her hands in the soil, checking the sweet peas. They had germinated, all 12 seeds, small green arcs pushing up through the soil along the base of the south wall. And she stood up and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the gate. He came through first. He looked like 3 weeks of trail, dust on everything, a week's beard, the particular looseness of a man who has slept on the ground and eaten camp food and worked hard every day and is now doing the last calculation of a long effort. His horse was tired. He was tired. He came through the gate and into the yard and stopped. She was standing at the garden wall with her apron dirty and her hair coming out of its braid from the afternoon work, which was not how she'd imagined this. In the idle moments she'd allowed herself to imagine it, but was in fact how it was. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Sweet peas are up," she said. He looked at the wall, at the small green growth along the twine. "All 12?" he said. "All 12. He got down from the horse, which took the particular careful effort of a man whose body has been doing too much for too long, and he handed the reins to Eddie, who had come up behind him and took them without being asked, and he walked across the yard to the garden wall. He stood next to her and looked at the sweet peas. They were small, barely 2 inches, but green and committed, reaching for the twine above them. "Margaret's seeds," he said. "Yes." He looked at them for a moment. "7 years," he said. "Those seeds have been in that tin for 7 years." "I know." He said it quietly, not to her specifically, not to anyone specifically. She'd be glad they're growing. Lillian did not say anything to that. She stood next to him at the garden wall and looked at the 12 small green plants and let the moment be what it was. Then, from inside the house, came a sound. Hazel's voice, the specific vocal quality of a baby who has heard something she recognizes and is announcing her recognition. And then a series of other sounds. The kitchen door, small, rapid footsteps that were too quick and unsteady to be anything but a child who had recently learned to walk and was still negotiating the gap between ambition and execution, and then the screen door, and then Hazel was on the porch. She stood at the top of the porch steps in the afternoon light, barefoot because she was always escaping her shoes, her dark hair in the 2 small braids Lillian had gotten good at, wearing the flour sack dress with the blue border that Carl's last supply run had brought back. She was looking at the yard, and she was looking for the thing she'd heard, which was the horses, which she had not yet located. Then she found Silas. She looked at him with the full focused attention she gave to significant things. He was standing very still at the garden wall. He looked back at her with an expression Lillian had never seen on his face, and she had been watching his face for 4 months, and she knew its terrain. It was an expression she didn't have a name for, something that was several things at once: recognition, tenderness, something older and more complicated underneath both of those. Hazel regarded him for another moment. Then she stepped off the porch. She did it decisively, the way she did everything now that she'd decided walking was her primary mode. Down the step, she had recently mastered steps with concentration, across the porch, down the next step, and then she was on the ground and she was walking across the yard toward him in the particular way she walked, which was with her arms out slightly for balance and her whole body committed to the direction. And it was not the graceful walk of a child who had been doing it for months, but the urgent, earnest walk of a child who has somewhere to be and intends to get there. She walked to Silas Boone across the yard of Black Ridge Ranch in the afternoon light of late April, and she got both hands on his boot, which was the first thing she could reach, and she held on and looked up at him. He crouched down. It cost him. She could see that. 3 weeks of hard work in every joint, but he did it, and he was at her level, and Hazel transferred her grip from the boot to his hand, examining his fingers with her forensic attention, And then she looked up at his face from 8 inches away and said something emphatic and entirely wordless. He said, just as quietly, "Hello, Hazel." She said something else. "I know," he said. "I was gone a while." Lillian stood at the garden wall with her dirty hands and her coming-out braid and watched Silas Boone talk to her daughter in the yard, and she thought about the word courage, which people use too easily for too many things. They used it for dramatic moments, for singular acts, for the things that announced themselves as requiring bravery. But she had learned, in the hospital in Butte and in the stagecoach to nowhere, and in this kitchen in this house over one long Montana winter, that the harder courage was the quiet kind, the kind that didn't announce itself, the kind that walked into a stranger's kitchen and started a fire, or saved seeds for 7 years and didn't throw them away, or got back on a horse 3 weeks later because you said 3 weeks and you meant it. The kind that let someone crouch down in the yard and talk to your daughter like it was the most natural thing in the world, and just stood there and let it be true. Okpam. He asked her that evening, not over supper. The men were there for supper, and the supper was good, and there was the noise and the business of a table full of people reunited after 3 weeks, and she watched the men eat and talk, and watched Silas at the head of it, and felt the rightness of this place in a way that was no longer new, but had become something she trusted. After, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse and Hazel was asleep in the pine cradle in the corner of the kitchen, and the dishes were done, and the kitchen was quiet, he was at the table. She was at the stove, not doing anything useful, just standing near the warmth the way you do at the end of a long day. "Lillian," he said. She turned. He was not a man who made speeches. She knew that about him well enough that she did not expect one, and she was right not to expect one. He said what he said plainly, the way he said everything that mattered to him. "I don't want you to stay as the cook," he said. "I want you to stay as my wife, if you're willing. I want Hazel to grow up on this ranch. I want to build this with you. All of it." He paused. "I'm not pretending I'm not afraid of it. I told you in February that I was, and that's still true. But I'm more afraid of the alternative, which is watching you leave in the spring and spending another 7 years being very efficient at being alone." She looked at him across the kitchen for a long moment. This was the thing about Silas Boone. He was not charming, did not perform, did not offer her anything polished or constructed. What he offered was exactly what he was, which was a man who had been broken by something and had kept going anyway, and who was standing in his own kitchen telling her the truth about his fear. She found that more valuable than anything more elegant would have been. She thought about what she would have said to herself in the hospital in Butte if she could have told herself where she would be 10 months later. She thought about the letter she'd carried in her pocket until the creases went soft. She thought about walking 4 miles in the cold with Hazel on her hip toward a ranch she'd never seen, toward a man who had told her no before she'd even gotten up the porch steps. She thought about what it had taken to stay, not the dramatic part. That part had been easy in a way, because necessity makes decisions simple. The hard part had been the slow part, the ordinary days. The willingness to let the ordinary days mean something. That was the real frontier, she thought. Not the land, not the winters, not the distances between things. The real frontier was the interior one, the one inside the people who lived out here, the one that had to be crossed not once but daily, the choice made every morning to keep building rather than just enduring. She had crossed it, so had he. The crossings had looked different but had brought them to the same kitchen, and here they were. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, in case it needed saying twice. He let out a breath that had more in it than the word exhale covered. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at her, and that thing happened in his face that had been happening incrementally all winter. The opening of something that had been closed for a long time, the particular change in a person who has been holding themselves very carefully and has finally decided it's safe to stop. He got up from the table. He crossed the kitchen. He stood in front of her and he put his hands on her face, calloused, work-worn hands, careful. And he looked at her for a moment the way you look at something you have wanted to look at directly for a long time and have not permitted yourself to. And then he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was not a perfect moment, and it was not a pretty one. She had garden dirt still somewhere on her forearm, and he had trail dust in his hair, and Hazel chose exactly that moment to make a sound from the cradle in the corner that suggested she was reconsidering sleep as a commitment.
But it was true, which was the only thing that had ever mattered to either of them. They married in June. Not a large wedding. There was no church for miles, and neither of them was inclined toward ceremony for its own sake. Hector rode to town and came back with the justice of the peace, a small spare man named Aldous Webb, who had performed perhaps 300 such ceremonies and approached this one with the quiet competence of someone who understood that the legal part was the smallest part of what was happening.
It was on the front porch of the ranch house, on a Saturday morning when the weather had finally decided to be generous. The men were there. Carl in a clean shirt, the collars of which appeared to pain him. Eddie Marsh, who had written to his mother about it and received back a letter that made him fold it carefully and put it in his front pocket. The Calloway brothers cleaned up and loud about nothing in particular. Anders Lindqvist, who had to duck under the porch roof and stood near the edge of it like a tree that had grown too large for its designated space. Hector, who stood with his hands clasped in front of him and his hat in his hands, and looked at some point between the justice of the peace and the mountain in the distance with the expression of a man who was doing something he considered important and had no intention of acknowledging it. Lillian wore the blue dress she'd had in her suitcase since Missouri, the one she'd washed and pressed that morning and which fit differently now than it had in September. Not worse, just differently. The difference of a body that had been working hard for a long time and had become what it was doing. She had Hazel on her hip for the first part of it, and then Carl held Hazel, who was exploring the buttons of Carl's clean shirt with scientific thoroughness. Silas wore his best shirt and his good boots, and a look of compressed focus that she recognized as what he looked like when he was doing something he considered serious, which was everything, but this more than most. Aldous Webb said the words. They said the words back. Silas put a ring on her finger, a plain band, gold, that had belonged to his mother, and she put one on his that she had bought from the supply man in Harlan on the last supply run with money from her saved wages. That was it. That was all of it. Carl handed Hazel back to Lillian, and Hazel immediately reached for Silas, and he took her, and she put both hands on his face in the examining way she had, and he stood there and let her examine him, and Carl made the sound in his throat he'd made in the kitchen when Hazel had walked to him, and Eddie Marsh looked briefly at the sky. Hector shook Silas's hand. Then he turned to Lillian and he looked at her for a moment with the direct, serious attention he gave to things of real importance, and he said, "This is a good ranch, Mrs. Boone. It got better." She said, "So did I." He nodded once, satisfied, and put his hat back on and went to see about the horses. That summer, the sweet peas bloomed. Margaret's sweet peas, along the south wall of the kitchen garden, climbing the twine Silas had put up before the drive in the last days of March. They came in pink and white and a deep reddish purple she hadn't expected from the seeds, and they climbed and spread until the south wall of the kitchen garden was covered in them. And on the afternoons when the wind came down off the mountain, it came across that wall and brought the smell of them into the kitchen through the open window. She noticed the smell first on a morning in late June when she was making breakfast and Hazel was on the kitchen floor walking between the stove and the table and back, the circuit she did endlessly now, practicing the skill with the devotion of someone who understood it was foundational to everything else. Lillian stopped what she was doing and stood at the window and breathed in the smell of those flowers and thought about Margaret, whose handwriting was on the envelopes in the tin on the pantry shelf. She thought, "Thank you." Not to anyone particular. Just into the air of the kitchen, the warm, good-smelling air of a kitchen that was fully itself, that had become over the course of one long winter what a kitchen was supposed to be. The center of a house that was the center of a life. Silas came in from the barn and stopped. "Smell that?" she said. He stood in the kitchen doorway and breathed in. His face did the thing she had watched work its way from closed to open across all the months she'd known him, the thing that was still not easy for him and probably never would be, but that happened now, regularly, reliably. The way things happen when they're real. "Yes," he said. Hazel arrived at his boots, completed her circuit. "Again?" he said to her. He set his hat on the hook by the door and went to the far end of the kitchen and crouched down and held out a hand, and Hazel turned around with the serious efficiency of a person with somewhere to be and walked back across the kitchen toward him, steady on her feet now, confident, not the urgent, earnest walk of April, but something that was beginning to look like her own particular way of moving through a space. Lillian watched her daughter walk toward her husband across the kitchen floor of the ranch that had become their home, in the smell of flowers coming through the open window, in the warm morning light of a Montana June. She turned back to the stove. Some things you didn't need to frame or hold or make into a statement. Some things you just lived inside, and the living was the point. This was what she had come to understand over the course of one impossible winter and one slow, necessary spring. That survival was not an achievement. Survival was just the beginning of the question. The real question, the one that demanded more than endurance, more than getting through, was what you chose to build in the space that survival cleared. Whether you used that cleared space to plant something, or whether you left it empty, called the emptiness safety, and waited alone for a winter that never quite ended. She had planted things. So had he. Not because they were brave exactly, but because the alternative had finally become more frightening than the risk. Because a tin box of seeds had been waiting 7 years, and the soil in those beds was good, and the south wall had just the right light, and some things, if you didn't plant them, were lost. Not every seed took. That was true of gardens, and true of everything else. Some of what they'd both lost was simply gone, and the honest version of the story did not pretend otherwise. Thomas was gone. Margaret was gone. William was gone. Those losses were permanent, and they were real, and they did not get redeemed or replaced. What happened instead was something smaller and more honest than redemption. Life continued, and in its continuation, if you were paying attention and willing, it offered you new things. Not better things, not compensation for what was taken. Just new things with their own weight and their own worth. Black Ridge Ranch was not a fairy story. It was a working ranch in Montana with a mud problem in March, and a sick colt every winter, and a north fence line that needed repairing every spring, and 6 men in the bunkhouse who had their own histories and their own complications, and their own Tuesday mornings when everything felt heavier than it should. It was the smell of sweet peas through the kitchen window, and the smell of wood smoke in cold mornings, and the specific sound of a household waking up and doing what needed to be done. It was Hazel walking across the kitchen toward a man who had built her a cradle before he knew she was coming. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the kind of more that people spend their whole lives looking for in the wrong places, not understanding that it's built incrementally, in the small daily decisions to stay and try and keep the fire going and get up before 5 and start again. Lillian Cross had walked into this kitchen with nothing but necessity and a baby and a worn-out suitcase, and she had stayed by making herself useful. And then she had stayed because she had built something worth staying for. And then she had stayed because she had found, in this cold and difficult and unglamorous place, what she had not known she was looking for when she got on the stagecoach in December. Not safety, not comfort, not the end of hard things. Home. The kind you make rather than find. The kind that requires you. Outside the window, the sweet peas moved in the mountain wind, pink and white and deep reddish purple. Climbing the twine on the south wall of the kitchen garden, reaching for the light with the absolute commitment of living things that have been given what they need and are doing what they were always meant to do. The morning was warm. The stove was on. Hazel laughed.